Olá a todas e a todos, está começando agora mais um Brasil de Fato Entrevista e hoje a nossa conversa é em outra língua, é em inglês. Peço desculpas, inclusive, de antemão pelos deslizes, mas é por um bom motivo. Nós vamos conversar com Clara Mattei, que é professora da New School of Social Research dos Estados Unidos. Hello, professor.
Hello, so nice to be here.
Clara Mattei é professora de economia da The New School for Social Research, em Nova York, nos Estados Unidos. É autora do livro The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism, em tradução livre, A Ordem do Capital, como os economistas inventaram a austeridade e abriram caminho para o fascismo, que será lançado no Brasil ainda este ano pela editora Boitem.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. I saw that you spent 10 years writing the book that was born of your PhD thesis. So how and when did you decide to go deep in this subject?
It all started when I was living through the Mario Monti years of great austerity in Italy. He came to power after the sovereign debt crisis in our country, and I was studying, and I, of course, was living on my own skin, like the majority of people around the globe still today do, the effects of austerity. So the defunding of public education, the defunding of health. I saw people in Italy get poorer and poorer visibly. And it was a country in which we did not have people in the streets. The streets started becoming full of people who did not have homes anymore. The work is a work in historical political economy. So it's based on primary sources. It's based on the reconstruction of the past through a new lens by looking at these materials that have not been published yet. But the reason was that the type of debate about austerity that was happening in the media, in public policy, even amongst left-wing movements, was a debate that was very dissatisfactory because it was very apolitical. They transformed austerity in this technical tool to manage the economy, and the conversation was all about whether austerity was working or not to balance the budget and boost growth. And it was a debate that had no way out, and it was very not very useful to understand why austerity kept emerging, even if clearly it was not producing growth and it was not helping to solve the debt problem. So this is why the historical study is very important, because it gives us a lens, the lens of class analysis, that was instead missing from contemporary economic debates, which were very technocratic. So the attempt here is to look at what happened 100 years ago, to show how austerity has a very clear political logic, which is that of preserving all of us in a situation of precariousness, of market dependence, thus disempowering the majority in order for the system to protect itself, for capital order, the title of the book, the capital order, to maintain itself intact. And this is only visible, I think, if you look at history, because it's in a moment in which capitalism was thoroughly contested after the First World War, that we really see how austerity operated as a counteroffensive used by the elite to foreclose any alternatives to our system.
Yes. You introduced us into the book talking about several economical and political crises in countries around the world. Since that this crisis and austerity was intrinsic to our modern society, in the last years, again, we saw a crisis of neoliberalism all around the world. I will say something that people from the beginning of the last century already said. The economic model doesn't fit anymore, right?
Yes, absolutely. We are in another moment in which people are not believing in the system, I think. And this is why, in fact, austerity is back with a vengeance. And not only in Brazil, but I live in the United States. The reason why the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank in the United States, is raising interest rates is because the majority of people are not going back to work. We have many American workers, 46 million in 2022, who left their jobs because they're sick of being exploited and because they see that the system is not working for them, but it's working for a very small few who constantly enrich themselves. So it is in this situation in which austerity needs to come back to convince us that actually, no, we are the ones who are wrong and there is no other way out but to impose sacrifice on the working people and ultimately to cut wages in order to attract investors' confidence.
And capital seems to try to re-stabilize and preserve himself all the time. So even if it's a crisis, the banks, all the system, even liberal governments still try to protect it, right?
Absolutely. But this, I think, is a message of hope that emerges out of taking history seriously, is that capital is not fixed. It's not a given. And it's not a thing, it's not an object. It's actually a social relation, and the social relation being the majority accepting their condition of being selling their capacity to work for a wage. This social relation is not in any way static, it's dynamic, and it can also be subverted. So it's actually the reality is that the capital order is very fragile, and this is why austerity is so important to it, because it protects it from all these demands for social change that keep emerging. So the message here is that we need to know how the ruling class operates in order to preserve an unjust system. We need to stop idealizing capitalism as a system that can be reformable and flexible to incorporate our needs, to realize that capitalism has rigid limits. The limit is that it's a system that grows, produces only for profit. And this requires austerity. So yes, as you said at the beginning, the strong thesis here is that austerity is not an exception to capitalism. It's not just what you see during the neoliberal moment, starting from the early 80s. It's much more intrinsic to the long history of capitalism. It's in the DNA of the system, exactly because for capitalism to work, the majority has to be disempowered, precarious, market dependent. And this is what austerity does. It shifts resources from the majority of the people who make the money on wages to the minority who make their income from capital and rent.
You said the austerity was used as a technical and dispoliticized tool for the growth of authoritarian leaderships. What unite Mussolini, Jair Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, and Giorgia Meloni, for example?
What unites them is the question. So it's very important here to, let me take a step back. So what happens is that in the book, I reconstruct crisis of capitalism after the First World War. So exactly 100 years ago, 1919, 1920, were years in which the general public had given up on capitalism, thinking that a better future was to come with the reconstruction after the First World War. And all of these experiments based on workers' councils, demands for economic democracy, meaning that people were taking back on their own hands the production and distribution of resources, were concretely happening. So I focus on the movement of Antonio Gramsci in Torino, l'Ordine Nuovo, in which actually you see how there was an active effort to not only think differently, but act differently. And you could only act differently if you were actually thinking differently, but you could also only think differently if you're acting differently. So the importance of praxis, of actually a different society stemming from experiments within the factory and also in the countryside, with people taking back the ownership of the means of production and the organization of labor. In this explosive situation, the bourgeoisie got very scared because, of course, they were gaining from capitalism and they wanted to protect it, and any form of economic democracy and distribution would have meant in a way, the overhaul of their privilege. So it's in this moment that we see the emergence of austerity as a counteroffensive. And what you see is two things related to your question. One is that economists participated very actively in constructing supposed neutral economic models, neutral theory, scientific knowledge, to tell people that they were ignorant, they did not understand, and ultimately that they were living beyond their means, and they had to accept the hard truth, as they put it, of hard work and abstaining from consumption. So this austerity motto, consume less, produce more, was imposed on the population of Italy and Britain. This is, my study is focused on these two countries because I'm interested in showing how austerity emerges where economic democracy is more palpable. And at that moment, it was in Europe that actually people had also gained the right to vote, for example. But what you see is that economists and governments ally, their economists are called to the government to help impose on the population this treatment of austerity. And austerity came in a variety of forms. It was not just cuts in the expenditure. It was, first of all, cuts in social expenditure. It was regressive taxation. So the fact that actually increased consumption taxes, what we see all over the world still now, you increase the taxes on the people, you cut the taxes on the rich, you cut corporate taxes, you cut taxes on real wealth, and so on. Austerity was about increasing interest rates. So again, what we see today, so this is monetary austerity. And finally, austerity was about what I call industrial measures, meaning direct attacks on unions, privatization, deregulation of labor, and wage suppression. So this austerity trinity, fiscal, monetary, industrial, was imposed on the population, also thanks to economists who are saying this is the right way forward, and we tell you because we are the experts and we are objective. So in this sense, what is obvious is that economists played a very classist role. They participated in this one-sided class war against their own citizens. And this could be done differently in the sense that we see that in Great Britain, we saw a liberal democracy use austerity against its own people, which increased unemployment and thus disciplined workers. Workers had to end their strikes, go back to work with a much lower wage and in worse conditions. In Italy, going back to your point, we see that it was actually Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism, who was the most efficient implementer and student of austerity. So in this sense, Mussolini came to power not through a coup, but through election, just like Giorgia Meloni today and Orban today, but with an explicit intention to impose austerity. So it was telling people, do not worry, we will get Italian citizens to stop striking, stop complaining, and go back to work. Now, I think what we see today is that a lot of these quote unquote authoritarian, para-fascist politics emerge slightly differently, emerge because people are upset about austerity, and austerity has won over them to the point that there's no classes anymore. People think they're individuals, and this is a typical message of austerity: is there are no classes, there's no antagonism, it's only individuals, and actually it's the entrepreneurs who lead the economic machine, not the workers. So I think right now, for the case of Italy, we see that Meloni actually came to power because she was actually promising social redistribution, which of course did not come, because as soon as she came to power, she once again imposed austerity, just like Benito Mussolini and many other of these authoritarian regimes.
And about this, and you said that the austerity was not successful in stabilizing economic crisis, but was successful for stabilizing class relations. Now we saw a global change in work relations. The unions are getting weak, maybe losing powers in in some countries. And how could reborn a new organization from workers?
Yes, a couple of ideas here. First of all, is that even if there is this sense by which workers are weaker, this is because of the operation of austerity in our lives for over 100 years that has been really successful, as you put it. Austerity is not successful in achieving its stated goals of economic growth and debt repayment, but it's very successful in achieving what is really the most important goal of all, which is that of making sure that people don't think they can live in a different society, making sure that people accept their condition as wage workers. So again, reimposing the capital order. And this, of course, also traps our minds because the models of the economists have us think that, again, workers don't count and it's only entrepreneurs who count. And so it's fair and correct to shift resources away from the lazy ones in favor of the supposed meritorious ones, right? So they provide the justification for these policies of extraction from all of us. Clearly, austerity has been successful, and we see it historically. Workers have lost power, bargaining power, and also power of imagination, of thinking of a new future. This said, I would like to point to the fact that class war does not stop under capitalism. It's a constant. Our system, again, is in motion, is a process. There's nothing fixed to it, even if economists want us to think that there's something fixed, because thinking that something is fixed disempowers us and traps our imagination. So I would like to say that, of course, there's a whole reason why workers are not doing very well in this historical moment, but not for nothing. There's also a lot of new, fresh mobilization. In the United States, for example, it's actually the service sector, people in restaurants, in hotels, in these areas where usually workers have been very precarious and very individualized, who are now unionizing. Starbucks, Amazon, Chipotle. And this is scaring a lot the ruling classes. So I would say that we are in a moment, in fact, in which there is again some form of turmoil. Of course, it's not the revolutionary spirits of 100 years ago, but there are a lot of demands to break away. So to go to what your question is, that I do feel very hopeful. I was just in South Africa presenting the book, and I organized and met with activists in the townships. The townships in South Africa is a place where apartheid is still real in terms of economic disenfranchisement. However, there's a lot of energy on the ground, a lot of people, that young generations who have left the old categories and are thinking anew. And I think what is important for us to move forward is to give space to these initiatives, which are all about gaining back independence and self-sufficiency. So breaching the main trap we're in, which is market dependence. What do I mean by market dependence? I mean that all of us, the majority of us, in order to make a living, have to have money in our pockets. If you want to eat, you got to buy something at the supermarket. If you want to live, you got to pay your rent. If you want to go get cured, you need to pay for the doctors. If you want to go to school, a lot of time you have to pay. So this is the outcome of austerity, which commodifies all aspects of our lives so that we become more powerless. Now, I think the first mission here is actually to be able to gain back our power from organizing through councils, through neighborhoods, through local activity, ways of producing and distributing on our own, so that we don't depend on wages coming from capitalists, and we don't spend our money in supermarkets so that everything just leaves as soon as it comes into our household. We need to keep the resources within our community. And I think, this is a very first important step to get people involved in organizing, collaborating, and realizing that it's not enough to just go vote at elections. Voting at elections is a very superficial act. It's something that keeps this economic servitude alive. So we need to breach and combat economic servitude. And this will show us how it's the first step in a much more ambitious project, which is much more than social democracy. It's actually the overturn of wage relations as such. And again, I think this is happening. It's happening in the townships. I was there very early on. It's happening in Chile, where councils are strong. I think it's happening everywhere. The point is that the media doesn't talk about it, but it's enough to be involved, go in the streets, meet your neighbor, to see that these realities exist. And it's the reason why austerity is there to stop these processes. But we need to fight against it.
Bringing the conversation here from Brazil, the idea of having a high primary budget is the main debate in Brazil nowadays. This eternal discussion makes it impossible to advance in the way of positive agendas for the country. On the other hand, many people, including the president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, believe that the high interests will prevent economic growth and the control of inflation should not be the main focus. This idea of a primary budget begins in the same place as austerity?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. This is exactly what austerity does. It serves the message there is no alternative. Balancing the budget is a priority that is indisputable. It's, again, a neutral, necessary priority. Now, the message of the book is not that these economists are necessarily wrong. I think a lot of the time it's actually the case, especially for countries in the south of the globe, that under capitalism, the limits are real in the sense that it is a problem if inflation is high. It is a problem if your currency is devalued. But this speaks to the economic violence that is very structural to the system. This is why the solution is not just to try to patch up with some reforms our system, because in fact, the chokehold is strong, and it is the case that under capitalism, we do depend on investors' confidence in order for the economy to grow. So how do you attract investors? You attract investors only if you keep taxes on wealth low, taxes on corporation low, only if you actually open up, privatize. What is happening right now is that huge asset managers are actually buying infrastructure, buying houses, so as to extract as many fees and as much rent from our necessity to reproduce in our daily lives as possible. But this is actually what the state under capitalism has to do, is ultimately open up to these private investors. This is the reality of our system. This is why it's very idealistic to think that a capitalist state can really oppose these global trends of austerity. This is why, again, we really need to try to find ways through processes of breaking away from private property of the means of production, wage relations altogether. Because, capitalism does trap us. So I don't know if that makes sense. This debate amongst economists, of course, they make it sound like it's not a political choice. And we can say, of course, it is a political choice. But this political choice is also a constrained choice in the sense that it's the political decisions that are favorable to maintaining some form of capitalist market stable, right? Which requires our subordination to these laws of the market that ultimately strangle us and benefit a very small minority. So these political choices are constrained, but we can also think bigger than just some small crumbs to the people to keep us at bay. We need to think bigger and think about how to actually breach our position of subordination towards the market.
Yes. The last one. Here in Brazil in 2016, the government, not elected by the people, for the people, by the way, created a fiscal anchor, which is known as teto de gastos, something like a spending ceiling in a literal translation. The idea was control the budget and the relation of the public debt and the GDP. In reality, what we saw was a drastic reduction of social investments like education, public health care, and other social programs. This austerity policy, with other events of our political system here in Brazil, paved the way for the election of Jair Bolsonaro. Movements like this could be a new rule for the advance of extreme right-wing parties.
Yes. So this again speaks to the fact that austerity is no mistake. You know, a lot of people on the left say, oh, austerity is just bad economics, it's a mistake. No, unfortunately, it's not a mistake. What you just described speaks to the success of austerity. People have been so disempowered that they lost their sense of class unity. They lost their sense of being collective, fighting from the enemy, who are the few who benefit from the system, and ended up actually voting for these few who benefit from the system, because austerity individualizes us. Austerity has this thing that we can all become wealthy entrepreneurs if we try hard, and that ultimately we should be ashamed of being poor. So the result of why people vote, even in the United States, for someone like Trump, is exactly because of austerity's success. Now, I don't think we can blame the people for voting for Bolsonaro, for Trump. We should blame the ruling elite, including, unfortunately, the Democratic Party and all the supposed more left-wing parties who ultimately with greater hypocrisy have been doing austerity all along. Austerity cuts party lines, right? And unfortunately, it's the fact that those who supposedly represented the people, including the unions, have been supportive of austerity that has created this sense of there's no hope, and we should do all the best we can to save ourselves as an individual, not looking at the fact that we are actually all producers, collective producers, who should fight against exploitation and fight against those who exploit us. So it's only, I think, by really recreating the sense of class cohesion and building on class formation that we can break away from the trap of people thinking that authoritarian regimes will save us. They will not save us, but neither will the Democratic parties a la Biden, who are, again, defunding all the social sectors everywhere.
Professor Clara, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy I will be with you in Brazil and visiting you guys soon, I hope.
Yeah, we'll be meeting here. Thank you.
Thank you.
E a você que nos acompanhou até aqui, muito obrigado. Na próxima semana voltamos com mais uma entrevista. Tchau, tchau.